Hey guys, tonight we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly. The intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies. A time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one is watching. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets and candlelit chambers while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we understand it now, simply wasn't a luxury many could afford, and traveling didn't improve the odds of discretion. Inns regularly featured shared beds, with complete strangers curling up shoulder to shoulder, hoping no one snored or worse, cuddled. But if you weren't married, things became far more delicate. No companionship, no secret glances, no moonlit meetings in the herb garden. But of course, humans are rarely so simple. Temptation, curiosity, and the ache of loneliness didn't disappear behind monastery walls. Bishops, monks, and confessors wrote extensively about what was considered proper behavior. Manuals and confession guides laid out rules in excruciating detail. Certain days were deemed off-limits. You couldn't be close during holy feast days, fasting periods, or liturgical seasons like Lent and Advent. Even within marriage, expression was expected to be modest, restrained, and free from excessive enthusiasm. Some abbeys quietly added higher fences or bricked up windows, not to keep the world out, but to keep wayward hearts in. Considered the most natural, it was seen as least likely to offend heavenly sensibilities. Anything else was met with suspicion. Passionate encounters were considered spiritually risky. And confession? It wasn't always gentle. Priests were trained to ask detailed, pointed questions. These weren't vague inquiries about the soul. They were direct and often awkward. You had to be discreet twice as quiet, 3 times as careful. Intimacy was not for joy or relaxation. It was strictly functional. Its purpose, according to doctrine, was to create life. Anything outside that narrow lane was frowned upon, if not outright condemned. Pleasure was at best a distraction, and at worst a sin. Communities were small, ears were sharp, and gossip spread with remarkable efficiency. Gossip, after all, required no translation and traveled faster than even the plague. Intimacy had to navigate not just mood, but logistics. You might find yourself wedged between a fellow traveler and a pile of hay, wondering if romance was worth the risk of someone's muddy boots. Most peasants lived in modest dwellings with a kitchen, bedroom, and stable all coexisted within the same compact space. The smells mingled, the sounds overlapped, and life happened side by side. If a couple wanted time alone, they had to be clever. Timing was crucial. So was softness of voice. And ideally, the children were fast asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were rare. Beds were often shared. And even among the wealthier classes, it wasn't unusual for servants to sleep nearby, sometimes at the foot of the bed, sometimes pretending not to hear anything at all. Many noble households documented who slept where and with whom, for reasons that were more about inheritance or religious accountability than privacy. If you were married and both parties were awake, relatively clean, and not in the middle of livestock chores, then you could possibly settle onto a straw-stuffed mattress and hope for a quiet moment. For those in religious orders, the matter was quite simple. No, the church cast a long shadow over personal lives. Its teachings held sway over how people lived, loved, and laid their heads at night. These weren't just idle rules muttered on Sundays. Missionary position was not just the norm, it was prescribed. Let's start with the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets and candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we understand it now, simply wasn't a luxury many could afford, and traveling didn't improve the odds of discretion. Inns regularly featured shared beds, with complete strangers curling up shoulder to shoulder, hoping no one snored or worse, cuddled. But if you weren't married, things became far more delicate. No companionship, no secret glances, no moonlit meetings in the herb garden. But of course, humans are rarely so simple. Temptation, curiosity, and the ache of loneliness didn't disappear behind monastery walls. Bishops, monks, and confessors wrote extensively about what was considered proper behavior. Manuals and confession guides laid out rules in excruciating detail. Certain days were deemed off-limits. You couldn't be close during holy feast days, fasting periods, or liturgical seasons like Lent and Advent. Even within marriage, expression was expected to be modest, restrained, and free from excessive enthusiasm. Some abbeys quietly added higher fences or bricked up windows, not to keep the world out, but to keep wayward hearts in. Considered the most natural, it was seen as least likely to offend heavenly sensibilities. Anything else was met with suspicion. Passionate encounters were considered spiritually risky. And confession? It wasn't always gentle. Priests were trained to ask detailed, pointed questions. These weren't vague inquiries about the soul. They were direct and often awkward. You had to be discreet twice as quiet, 3 times as careful. Intimacy was not for joy or relaxation. It was strictly functional. Its purpose, according to doctrine, was to create life. Anything outside that narrow lane was frowned upon, if not outright condemned. Pleasure was at best a distraction, and at worst a sin. Communities were small, ears were sharp, and gossip spread with remarkable efficiency. Gossip, after all, required no translation and traveled faster than even the plague. Intimacy had to navigate not just mood, but logistics. You might find yourself wedged between a fellow traveler and a pile of hay, wondering if romance was worth the risk of someone's muddy boots. Most peasants lived in modest dwellings with a kitchen, bedroom, and stable all coexisted within the same compact space. The smells mingled, the sounds overlapped, and life happened side by side. If a couple wanted time alone, they had to be clever. Timing was crucial. So was softness of voice. And ideally, the children were fast asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were rare. Beds were often shared. And even among the wealthier classes, it wasn't unusual for servants to sleep nearby, sometimes at the foot of the bed, sometimes pretending not to hear anything at all. Many noble households documented who slept where and with whom, for reasons that were more about inheritance or religious accountability than privacy. If you were married and both parties were awake, relatively clean, and not in the middle of livestock chores, then you could possibly settle onto a straw-stuffed mattress and hope for a quiet moment. For those in religious orders, the matter was quite simple. No, the church cast a long shadow over personal lives. Its teachings held sway over how people lived, loved, and laid their heads at night. These weren't just idle rules muttered on Sundays. Missionary position was not just the norm, it was prescribed. Some friars and confessors became, unintentionally, the most informed individuals when it came to the private affairs of their community. They knew which couples needed a gentle reminder about decorum, and which might require a stern talking to or a recommended penance. Still, these rules weren't followed equally. Some areas were stricter than others. Some priests chose not to ask, and many peasants chose not to tell. Quietly, behind closed doors or shared curtains, life went on. The church's calendar became an obstacle course. Sundays were off limits, Fridays too being days of penance. Wednesdays were. Violating church expectations could lead to more than whispered rumors. A couple deemed too bold could be summoned for penance or shamed in front of the community. A saying of the time sums it up neatly. Better a wealthy match with a grim face than a poor one with dimples. Among peasants, the calculations were simpler but no less strategic. Behind barns or by the village well, affection found its moments. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions. But if caught, the consequences could be severe. Public penance, heavy fines, or the withering stare of a father gripping a pitchfork. A suitor was judged by his fields, his ox, and his hands. A woman by her ability to keep a household, churn butter, and stay out of market squabbles. Intimacy during a forbidden time could be blamed for sickly children, poor harvests, or spiritual ruin. Emotional connection wasn't part of the base package. If it came at all, it was seen as a blessing. The stakes felt high, even if the act itself was natural. Suspicious. Add Lent, Advent, saint feast days, fast days, and even phases of the moon, and you are left with very little time. Some confession manuals banned intimacy nearly half the year. Any deviation invited guilt, more confession, and stern lectures. They had chaplains and spiritual advisors, observing their conduct and reporting missteps. Peasants, meanwhile, were more occupied with practical survival, fixing roofs, feeding animals, keeping warm. Their approach to rules was looser. If it was Tuesday and no one was watching, maybe they'd take their chances. One bishop even reprimanded a married couple for being too affectionate, meaning more than once a month. He gently suggested they redirect their passion to prayer. The couple, unsurprisingly, was less than enthusiastic about this divine suggestion. The nobility bore the brunt of ecclesiastical oversight, but consequences still loomed. Romance, as we think of it now, was rare. Marriage wasn't built on affection. It was rooted in alliances, family interests, and land. Dowries were traded, promises made, and peace kept between neighbors who once bickered over wandering pigs or misplaced tools. Courtship, if it happened, was heavily supervised. Families guarded their daughters carefully, and reputation meant everything. Among nobility, marriages were arranged with the precision of chess matches. Love might come later or never. Love existed, but often bloomed after vows were exchanged, not before. It was something that grew in quiet moments, not flashy gestures. Still, where rules existed, so did rebellion. Secret flirtations bloomed like wildflowers between cracks in stone. Songs passed between lovers. Stolen glances turned into moonlit walks. Let's clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, leaving her physically and morally sealed. Except, not really. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. No tailor advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing. Which makes sense because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith, if a little cynical. Of course, some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. Wasn't thrilled. Officially, A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the skin to illness. Others simply didn't have the time or the tub, or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket and the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the stables. Dental care? Well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure, and then removes their wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague, fixing the roof, and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. It condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments. More if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, expensive and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal or both. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations, you've grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. It would have caused more infections than it prevented indiscretions. In fact, most examples we have today come from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were created as joke items, warnings, or museum curiosities, not functioning devices. Actual handbooks for how these houses should be managed, clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied. Services were cataloged, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable details, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Noble women are often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. In many cases, they regulated them. That's right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially urban centers, brothels operated as legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes, and even designated specific red light districts long before the light bulb was invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a resume. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators, and any whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations. Lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative perfectly. And nothing says virtue like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic. The church. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it wasn't necessarily a life of constant misery either. There were even handbooks, yes. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering, a soft breeze through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, maybe once a month. If you were wealthy, you had options. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Now imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume was mostly for the elite. Deodorant, a dream of the distant future. Clothing didn't help. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps when everyone smelled equally awful, love was truly blind and nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. A few brave souls tried wax, and there are scattered references to lead. Let's call them medieval prototypes of what would later become familiar latex devices. But don't ask how they were made. You really don't want to know. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. And when it failed, which it often did well, that's where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was well common enough to require a lot of paperwork, known as fornication in church records, and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets, blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't guessing. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or more commonly denounced, loudly from the pulpit. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. The church, of course, was not amused. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. Despite what church authorities liked to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. And fined. Sometimes the fine went to the church, sometimes to the town, and occasionally to someone who claimed to have witnessed the event. Medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy resulted, or whether the couple eventually got married. In tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful, your neighbors usually weren't. If a couple was clearly serious and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or a firm push from both families. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at marriage untested, at least officially. She seemed virtuous, or she avoided the stable boy. Mostly. Other times, more invasive methods were used, like midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen, which science has since confirmed is not, in fact, a medieval chastity barometer. But that didn't stop anyone. But if she didn't, well, some eyebrows would rise, and a small fine or shotgun wedding might sort things out. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions. And if the sheet stayed clean, cue lawsuits, annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling a royal soap opera. Among nobles, however, consequences could be far worse, especially if inheritance or reputation was on the line. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Gossip could spread faster than a poorly stored meat pie in July. Human nature didn't start in the 20th century. But if you're wondering whether it was openly accepted, that's where things get complicated. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest, it didn't just ruin her, it could drag down her entire family's honor and property claims. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the purpose of making more villagers. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity wasn't just about morality. It was legal currency. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in something called hand fasting, a sort of informal engagement where the couple considered themselves betrothed. A broken engagement might spark a feud. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of planning. So how did they verify it? Well, badly. In some regions, that was legally enough to begin cohabiting. Punishments varied wildly, depending on region, time period, and who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and penance. Nobles, they might face exile, or quietly be ignored if they had enough land. The church later tried to tighten that loophole, but in the meantime, a lot of medieval babies were technically early arrivals. In some cases, getting married after the fact erased the fine kind of like retroactive permission. In others, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Early bird penalties, if you will. And let's not forget the social consequences. Among peasants, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. Noble women's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honor. Sometimes it came down to vague testimony and character references. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding, such as displaying a blood-stained sheet like a very awkward medieval Yelp review. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. Virginity was also linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is beautiful in theory and incredibly uncomfortable in practice. If you're wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Medieval society was structured around religious doctrine, social roles, and property rights. And all three had a lot to say about who could love whom. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labeled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts, like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was messier. We have records, poems, letters, even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, there were feelings involved, and possibly poetry. Let's be clear, adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a social offense. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but not legally punished unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial, a fine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in village gossip. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading through the village in nothing but a shift or having to pay for a new church bell. For noble daughters, consent often came after arrangements were made. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash. Saying no to the local reeve's son? Riskier still. Inside, families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied, but in the end, the dowry talked louder than she did, because nothing says divine justice like bronze acoustics. So when someone strayed, they weren't just breaking hearts, they were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile local gossip equilibrium. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval customs sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status and how many swords he owned. It wasn't about mutual respect or enthusiastic yeses. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional shrug from society. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and more longing. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That is right. Two people saying, "I will," in a field somewhere could technically be married. Romantic, possibly. Legally confusing? Absolutely. Noble women sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred lines. All-male monasteries and all-female convents created deep emotional bonds. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, loss of dowry rights, forced penance, or even exile, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life. Think less scarlet letter, more scarlet exit. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. You just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades. But there were songs, saints, stories, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives, risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride or property. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. The real danger, however, wasn't always the law. It was the husband. Honor killings weren't unheard of, particularly among nobles. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, jewels, annulments, or decade-long family feuds. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. Let's start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize the concept of consent in marriage. But here's the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory, doesn't mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For peasant women, choices were broader but still pressured. You can't control what people say or do, but you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. It was radical. Most people back then, and let's be honest, most people today chase comfort, admiration, money, or control. The noise of the world tells us we should seek more, acquire more, feel more. But Stoicism offered a quieter path. A path not of constant striving, but of inward calm. Live in harmony with nature. accept fate without resentment, and strive only to be good, not to feel good. And in the next generation, a new Stoic emerged, one shaped not by scrolls, but by sweat and endurance. His name was Cleanthes. He had once been a boxer, someone who earned his bread not by words, but by strength and sheer will. Their favorite analogy? Life is like being a dog tied to a cart. While Zeno emphasized detachment, Cleanthes allowed for certain emotions, wonder at nature, love for wisdom, so long as they served reason. He wasn't calling for indulgence, just balance. But what he lacked in flair, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He didn't take over the school with charisma. He simply lived its values more completely than anyone else. What good is a philosophy, he wondered, if it turns you into a machine? And then came the mind that sharpened Stoicism into something more. Chrysippus, the logician, the sculptor of its bones. Without him, Stoicism might have faded into history, just another cluster of porch-side musings. But Chrysippus gave it form, clarity, discipline. Logic was his art, and he shaped it like a sculptor chiseling marble. When someone accused him of hypocrisy, he simply replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick?" It became a true discipline, something to study, something to live, something to rely on when the world becomes noise and the heart seeks silence. He still knows how to treat illness. Stoicism wasn't about perfection. It was about practice. Stoicism became armor, not of steel, but of soul, trying daily to close the quiet gap between what we do and what we believe. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. He preached simplicity, but he also knew contradiction. He lived richly while writing about moderation, served tyranny while yearning for virtue. Philosopher, playwright, politician. To Epictetus, life's trials weren't setbacks. They were tests. They weren't written in marble. They were written in lived pain and enduring hope. Opportunities to grow stronger in character, softer in judgment, and firmer in peace. The most powerful man in the world, and perhaps the most quietly tormented. His reign was plagued by war, disease, betrayal. His own son would one day become a tyrant. "I am not a wise man," he said. Quiet reflections, notes, reminders, a book not meant for publication. Just thoughts to keep his soul from unraveling in the storm, but a lover of wisdom. That, perhaps, is the heart of Stoicism, not mastery, but the quiet pursuit of it. Not because they offer answers, but because they ask questions we still whisper in the dark. The knowledge that even when all else is taken from you, one thing remains: your ability to respond with grace. What is in my control? What kind of person do I want to be? What does it mean to live well even when the world does not? He served under Nero, a ruler whose name would become synonymous with cruelty. Seneca was wealthy, privileged, and yet he wrote not about luxury, but about restraint. Not about power, but peace. He owned nothing, not even himself. But he taught that true freedom doesn't come from ownership, it comes from within. In a world of emotional appeals and clever rhetoric, Chrysippus chose precision. If Stoicism was to survive, he believed, it had to be built like stone, unshakable, tested, and true. Not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily guide for people in the arena: statesmen, soldiers, servants, even emperors. You can either run with it or be dragged behind. Either way, the cart's going forward. Your only choice is how you move with it. He also introduced the idea of the lecton, the layer of meaning behind words, the part tied to logic. This wasn't just semantic, it deepened the Stoic trust in reason as the key to inner peace. Zeno wasn't alone for long. He expanded their ethics, metaphysics, and physics into a system that was both dense and illuminating. Hard, yes, but deeply human. His students began to gather under the Stoa, a shaded colonnade in Athens. His most enduring work, the Hymn to Zeus, wasn't a hymn of praise for comfort or ease. It was a gentle ode to order, to Logos, the rational soul of the universe. Even suffering, he believed, had its place in a cosmic plan. They came not to conquer the world, but to master themselves. These porch conversations slowly became one of the most resilient philosophies in human history. Stoicism would not burn bright with fame or fashion. It would endure, quiet and deep, like a slow-moving river. But philosophy doesn't live in theory. It breathes in practice. Before he ever copied a scroll or lectured beneath the painted porch, Cleanthes was a laborer. By day, he carried water for a gardener. By night, he studied philosophy. His hands were rough, his muscles worn, but his spirit unwavering. He embodied the belief that virtue came not from privilege, but from perseverance. He didn't theorize about hardship. He lived it. And every dawn brought with it the opportunity to live it again with grace. Cleanthes' stoicism was vast and quiet like a glacier, immovable, patient, timeless. Yet he also invited a little warmth into the cold. He was no showman. Some even mocked him for his slow speech. In Cleanthes, stoicism found its muscle. Not the kind that flexes, but the kind that holds you steady when the winds of fate howl loud. If Zeno planted the seed and Cleanthes watered it, Chrysippus built the trellis that let it grow skyward. He reportedly wrote over 700 works. Most are lost. But what remains of his thought reveals a man who pursued rigor above all else. He refined the core distinction at the heart of Stoicism between what is in our control and what is not. He believed that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. Not virtue plus friends, not virtue plus comfort, just virtue. Full stop. And yet, Chrysippus was no cold scholar. He had wit. Through Chrysippus, Stoicism matured. It stopped being only comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic laborers. And then Stoicism traveled. It drifted west overseas, over scrolls, and reached Rome. There, it would take on new life. The Romans weren't drawn to theory. They faced war, betrayal, loss. They wanted tools, not just thoughts. Enter Seneca the Younger. His letters to Lucilius still whisper wisdom. "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," he wrote. And that honesty made him real. He didn't pretend to be a sage. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, Epictetus gave it to the world. A former slave, crippled, impoverished. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." His teachings, recorded by his student Arrian, became a manual for resilience. And then the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, warrior, philosopher. And yet Marcus did not lash out. He wrote, not to others, but to himself. His Meditations remain one of the most beloved works in philosophy. And maybe that's why Stoicism endures. It doesn't promise happiness. It doesn't promise ease. It promises steadiness, a stillness in the storm. You can't control what people say or do, but you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. Quiet personal reflections, later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for anyone else's eyes, these pages offer a window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying to stay upright. Begin each day, he wrote, by telling yourself, today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. That wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's actions were not insults, they were reflections of their ignorance. And his duty wasn't to control others, but to control himself. He often reminded himself, you could die tomorrow. You could die today. So act now not with anxiety, but with purpose. That wasn't despair, that was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still remain untouched if your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected opulence. And while he couldn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways, he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in togas or ascetic monks. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. You can't control what people say or do, but you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. Of course, no philosophy is a magic cure. You'll still feel grief, still fail, still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a framework to get back up, reflect, and re-enter. In the end, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort: marble floors, vaulted ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in the morning sun. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire, and water into an immersive wellness center. At the core of this innovation was the hypocaust system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace, or prefernium. That's why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a building. In a society without smartphones, email, or newspapers, the baths functioned as a kind of open-air broadcast center. Gossip didn't trickle here. It flowed. Businessmen negotiated deals. Poets recited lines. Philosophers debated ethics. The acoustics of the domed rooms often helped amplify voices, a useful trick for anyone who wanted their cleverness overheard. The bathhouse was where ancient wellness philosophy met practical self-care. The heat of the caldereum opened pores, relaxed muscles, and helped with circulation. The cold plunge in the frigidarium reduced inflammation and invigorated the senses. The skin was scraped clean with strigils, which removed dirt, oil, and dead skin. Afterward, many Romans received massages using scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just olive oil. Today, we might call this detoxing or hydrotherapy. They just called it daily life. Doctors recommended it. Philosophers endorsed it. Even the military encouraged it. If you had a cough, aching joints, hot water, cold plunges, sweating, and massages were all believed to purify the body and balance the humors. The four fluids the Romans thought governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these got out of balance, you got sick. But a visit to the baths, with its cycle of heating, scraping, and cooling, could supposedly restore that balance. In a strange way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor all at once. It was unfiltered, buzzing, and deeply performative. But it was also where strategy was born. Real decisions, military, financial, personal, often started here, far from the formal halls of power. Because when everyone is half naked, sweating, and relaxed, masks fall away. And in the steam, the real empire whispered its plans. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets all mingled freely, with togas off and voices raised. Conversations carried across the tepidarium like wildfire. Who was sleeping with who? What was the emperor plotting? Which general just lost a battle in the east? Who bribed which magistrate to get out of paying taxes? If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, or what might happen soon, the bathhouse was the place to listen. It was entering a system one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by genius. They soaked right into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Or perhaps a patron would meet a client to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or drop a veiled threat all while lounging in the pool. Even emperors played the game. It's as said that Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made a point of visiting the public baths as an act of image control, appearing accessible, wise, and invested in the lives of ordinary citizens. Of course, they had private bath wings too, but showing up in the public zone was a statement. I'm still one of you. Sort of. This fire heated a space beneath the raised floor, supported by small columns called pilae. Hot air flowed through this subfloor chamber and up through flues in the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle oven. The result, a consistent, enveloping warmth without smoke suffocating the bathers. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. And the complex arrangement of rooms regulated temperature flow from the cooler apoditerium to the temperate tepidarium to the blazing caldarium. Romans also had steam rooms, saunas, and even primitive flushing toilets nearby. Sewage was carried away through underground drainage systems. Again, all gravity-powered. The baths weren't isolated marvels. They were integrated into the broader infrastructure of Roman urban life. Maintenance was constant. Workers known as fornicatores tended the furnaces, while others cleaned the pools, managed supplies of wood, or repaired tiles and plumbing. It was labor-intensive, but the reward was clear. These buildings didn't just last years. Many stood strong for centuries. Windows were designed to harness sunlight, and water was constantly circulating, clean, flowing, and heated to exacting standards. And let's talk about the aqueducts, the silent heroes of the empire. These elevated stone channels delivered vast quantities of water into the cities, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate year-round. Some of the grandest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of liters of water daily. Yet the system was so well built that waste was minimal and flow was constant. From there, you'd ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores and began the relaxation. You gossiped, worked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians. Others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings, echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved just a bit into the larger hum of the empire, one breath of steam at a time. Then came the caldarium, the heart of the experience, a hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaust. Here, bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils, and sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood. And honestly, they were probably right. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighborhood facilities. Everyone from senators to shoemakers made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You'd enter through the apoditerium, or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. But more than hygiene or health, baths were about belonging. You went to see and be seen. Roman baths weren't just impressive. They were engineering masterpieces. The architecture itself was strategic. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat. Domes diffused sound. The water wasn't just used for soaking. In an age with no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats, the Romans created a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow. Despite all the sweat, steam, and strigils, Roman baths were never just about physical cleansing. They were about information. This wasn't accidental. The Roman elite knew the baths were public arenas, and they used them strategically. Politics didn't stop at the Senate steps. It wasn't just politics that steamed up the tiles. To the Romans, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking polished. It was a critical part of health and medicine. And there's some logic to it, even by modern standards. Some of the larger bath complexes even included small medical clinics, where physicians, often Greek-educated, examined patients, offered treatments, or suggested dietary changes. These provincial baths weren't just carbon copies. They reflected local resources and customs, while still following the essential Roman layout. A poditarium, tepidarium, cholerium, frigidarium. In colder climates like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were especially important. Medicine didn't live in a laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science. It was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a poultice to your wound. That's because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness to them wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in Mat, the cosmic order that governed all things. So doctors, known as Swenu, weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of healing. Specific temples like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as proto-hospitals. People would sleep there in hopes of divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen, plus a recitation to ward off evil spirits. Psychological conditions now recognized as mental illness were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory. But to the Egyptians, it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all. In the land of the Nile, to be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong. Even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual, the first step in diagnosis was always observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin color, breath, and even urine or feces to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork. They were documented, compared, and passed down through generations. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the center of a system of channels, similar to a network of irrigation canals, through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed. Although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect, their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet when no physical explanation was found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from a god, a curse from an enemy, a lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest, magician, dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behavior of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Ipuwer Papyrus, physicians categorized diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols. And interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separated physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated, no spell was required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was filled with unseen forces. But through keen eyes, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils, many of which they combined with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result, a holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions, addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favorite ingredients, honey, prized for its antimicrobial properties and still used today in wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. They also used garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh, not just for their aroma, but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory effects. Their pharmacopoeia included more exotic fare as well: crocodile dung for contraceptives, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for particularly superstitious cures. To modern eyes, this may seem grotesque, but these remedies reflected their belief that the power of the ingredient lay not only in its physical properties, but also in its spiritual essence. Minerals like natron, a naturally occurring salt, were used to dry wounds, cleanse infections, and preserve bodies. Copper, known for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and mixed into salves. Oils from lotus, castor beans, and black cumin were used for massage and pain relief. Doses varied depending on the affliction. A prescription might read, mix crushed sycamore fruit, honey, and natron. Apply for 4 days. Recite the following spell over the mixture. In Egypt, words were medicine too. The spoken charm activated the cure, a reminder that for them, healing was as much about meaning as it was about chemistry. Far from primitive guesswork, Egyptian medicine was highly systematic, documented, and refined. While some remedies were bizarre, many were surprisingly effective, and some survive in spirit or science even today. Their medicine chest was drawn from the land, the body, and the gods, and they reached into all three to heal. While much of ancient Egyptian medicine focused on herbs and incantations, the Egyptians were not afraid to cut when necessary. They understood that some ailments needed more than a poultice or a prayer. They needed a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence of Egyptian surgery comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old medical text unlike any other from the ancient world. It is methodical, clinical, and strikingly modern in tone. It describes 48 cases, mostly traumatic injuries, skull fractures, broken collarbones, spinal wounds, and includes step-by-step instructions on examination, treatment, and prognosis. What's fascinating is how pragmatic the document is. It even classifies cases into 3 outcomes: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. In other words, treatable, uncertain, and hopeless. This was triage, a concept we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons used a range of tools: bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks, and needles. They practiced stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting bones with wooden splints, and even performing circumcisions. Some mummies show evidence of successful bone healing, indicating that patients survived their injuries and continued living for years. They were also pioneers in wound hygiene. In warmer places like North Africa or the Levant, some bathhouses expanded the shaded colonnades and cooled pools, offering relief from the blistering sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jash in Jordan, and Bath in England all featured impressive thermic, often with mosaics, sculptures, and inscriptions celebrating imperial generosity. These weren't just public works. They were propaganda in stone. Every polished marble slab and steaming pool reminded locals, this is Rome, and Rome takes care of its people. But baths also played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse served as a soft introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your own language at home, but once you stripped off your clothes and stepped into the steam, you were participating in a Roman ritual, one that transcended ethnicity, origin, or local tribe. It also became a mark of urbanization. A city wasn't truly Roman until it had proper baths. They often came bundled with forums, amphitheaters, and temples, creating civic centers that mirrored those of the capital. Bathing then wasn't just about hygiene. It was about civilization. Of course, local twists remained. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated Eastern architectural styles and mixed gender spaces. In Britain, Celtic traditions subtly influenced the bathing sequence. And in Egypt, older Hellenistic models blended with Roman designs to create hybrid complexes with lush courtyards and incense filers. No matter the local flavor, the Roman bath became a universal experience, one that made an empire feel cohesive. A place where even at the farthest frontier, you could close your eyes in the colarium, and for a moment, feel like you are in the heart of Rome. Like so much of Roman civilization, the glory of the baths didn't last forever. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did the great bathhouses. What had once been daily rituals for millions slowly slipped into disrepair, abandonment, and eventually ruin. Several factors contributed to this decline. First, the empire's economy crumbled under the weight of inflation, military overreach, and political instability. Funding the maintenance of vast bath complexes, which required teams of workers, constant fuel for the hypocaust, and clean water from aqueducts, became unsustainable. Then came the breakdown of infrastructure. Aqueducts fell into neglect or were deliberately destroyed during invasions. Without running water, the baths lost their core purpose. The once bubbling colariums went dry, and the marble halls echoed with silence. Religion also played a part. As Christianity became dominant, public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity. While some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths, others shut them down or repurposed them into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouses that carried forward many Roman innovations, heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness in a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular during the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. The baths of Caracalla, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome didn't just conquer through the sword. It conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on in our gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're channeling a bit of the empire. Steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt,